Back with you once again on this glorious Lord's Day. Certainly humbled to be able to present again once another lesson unto you. And today I thought we would we looked at anxiety a while back, and we called that series, or said we would start a series. And of course it'll be kind of peppered throughout the year. But a series on controlling our thoughts. So in other words, the way we think or the way we view the world. And today I thought we'd look at optimism and pessimism. I always get corrected on this. Pessimism. I'll probably mispronounce that quite often because I get caught with the S's there. But anyways, I wanted to look at these different aspects of the way we often view the world and ask ourselves, how should the Christian view the world? And should we look at it from an optimistic way, or should we look at it from a pessimistic way? And so before we get started, I thought we'd look at some I found an article from Cognifit. It's a kind of a psychology or psychiatric website, but it talks about the benefits of being optimistic versus pessimistic. And I just thought I would share this with you real quick, not necessarily from a spiritual, but from a physical aspect. It says the benefits of being pessimistic. It says optimistic is likely to take on more stress, or optimist, I should say, are likely to take on more stress because their tendency to see possibility and opportunity. Increased stress brings on increased risk of cardiovascular problems such as heart attack or increased blood pressure. Psychologists suggest that being pessimistic actually helps to deal with stress better. Pessimists start with low expectations of an event and examine all the worst possible outcomes, then can actually help you feel a little less nervous because you'll be prepared for the worst to happen. And then it says some studies also show that pessimists are more likely to take preventative action against possible health issues. This is because their tendency to think about what they could possibly go wrong is likely a constant battle of optimism versus pessimism. Benefits of being an optimist is, although that they take on more stress, optimists are also well equipped in handling that stress. Even if something goes wrong, they are able to see possibilities for the future. Pessimists, on the other hand, are likely to focus largely on the negative or on negativity, and pessimists are combined with stress is actually associated with depression. This makes optimism versus pessimism very tricky. People who have a more positive outlook on life are more likely to take care of themselves in terms of eating well and exercising. Studies have shown that optimists are have stronger social networks and better medical care. So again, that's just food for thought there from a clinical aspect of that type of thinking. But today we want to spend probably more of gleaning through the scriptures and see what we can, see if there's what we can find out is, should we have a optimistic view of the world, or should we have a pessimistic view of the world? And let's see what we can find. And I don't know if we'll get through all this in a timely manner. If not, we'll come back this evening and finish up. So just as an overview of this lesson, we'll define what optimism versus pessimism is, because I think before we can be discussing these terms, we need to be on the same wavelength as far as what they mean. We'll evaluate some situations situations where feelings and actions towards our fellow men or Christians, how should we take a view? Should we be positive or negative towards those individuals? What about our health, as that article mentioned? Our view towards the work of the church, and our view as our journey through our lives, if you will, or just everyday living. And then we'll also examine when when is a time that we should be pessimistic towards things. So again, let's look at the definition. The definition is defined as a disposition or tendency to look more favorable side of events or conditions, and to expect the most favorable outcome. That's what we mean by optimism. It might also be said the belief that good ultimately predominates over evil in the world. So that would be the optimistic worldview, if you will, or the belief that goodness pervades reality. So you have a more positive outlook on life, and you tend to believe that good will dominate over evil, and that ultimately goodness is what comes one's way. Perhaps sometimes definitions don't happen, so sometimes we look at like words, or what we call synonyms, and that gives us a better idea of what we're talking about. And some synonyms would be anticipation, assurance, brightness, calmness, certainty, cheer, cheerfulness, confidence, easiness, encouragement, enthusiasm, exhilaration, expectation, happiness, hopefulness, idealism, positivism, sureness, and trust are all synonyms for optimism. So all these words up here, so you can kind of get an idea of where we're coming from, or these type of words mean the same thing, to be an optimism, or have an optimistic viewpoint, if you will. Now let's look at the definition of what it is to be pessimism. The tendency to see or anticipate or emphasize only bad or undesirable outcomes, results, conditions, or problems. It's the doctrine that the existing world is the worst of all possible worlds, and that all things naturally tend to evil. And then the belief that the evil and pain of the world are not compensated by goodness and happiness. So as we can already see, that pessimism has a very negative connotation to it, that you tend to believe that evil predominates over goodness in the world, and we have not a good, that we often view that in any given situation that there will be a negative outcome in that. Some synonyms for this idea of being this definition of pessimism would be cynicism, dark side, dejection, depression, despair, dim view, distrust, despondency, expectation of the worst, gloom, grief, hopelessness, low spirits, sadness, and unhappiness. These are all synonyms or words that mean the same thing as pessimism. Pessimism. So I told you my S's would get tongue-tied there. So as I go throughout here, I've looked up various quotes of people down through history and how they have viewed the world, or tidbits of thoughts here. And this is René Descartes. He was a 5th century philosopher, mathematician, scientist. 15th century, I should say. And he's quoted in saying, "An optimist may see a light where there is none, but why must the pessimist always blow it out? So I think that's that's a good analogy of how optimists versus pessimists would view the world, or their actions might be. And the optimists might see they will see something positive, where the pessimists would they would just come out and if you had lit a candle, they would just blow it out and say, well, it was better off being dark to begin with. That would be the pessimistic view, if you will. So now let's evaluate from a scriptural standpoint. Should we be optimistic towards our fellow man or Christians? Can we be pessimistic or cynic towards our fellow brethren? I remember after services one morning, it wasn't here, it was at another congregation, but I remember somebody saying, and quote unquote, well, I can love him as a brother in Christ, but I don't have to like him. Now, what kind of attitude is that? I guarantee you that person, that guy, gal, whoever they were, they had a pessimistic view of that individual. And is that really how one should view their fellow brother in Christ? I think if we reflect on 1 John 3:10, if we look over there in 1 John, it says, in this the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not love his brother. So did this brother, when he said, I can love him like a brother, but that doesn't mean I have to like him, did he really take into an account of what John was teaching over there in his first epistle? I tend to believe not. Also, consider also in that same book, but next chapter over, chapter 4, verse 20, where it says, if someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar, and he also does not love his brother whom he has seen. How can he love God whom he has not seen? So again, if you have a pessimistic view towards a fellow Christian, or perhaps you don't like a fellow Christian, I would implore you to reevaluate the way you're thinking and ensure that you are in line with what the Scripture would have us to be. I don't think that the individual that had this idea that brotherly love did not equate to liking somebody had quite the correct understanding of what it is to love a fellow man. I also ask, can we afford not to love our neighbor? It's one thing, I understand that we're to love our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, and they should be our foremost priority, but can we also view that as people out in the world, or who we view as our neighbor? If we look back on Luke chapter 10, where we see the parable of the Good Samaritan, what kind of view did the priest and the Levite have towards the man who fell to the wayside? I would guarantee you, I bet you that they had a pessimistic view of that individual. If we look over there in chapter 10, verse 31 of Luke, it says, now by chance a certain priest came down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Did the priest sit there and reflect and say, I need to go and render aid to that individual? Or did he have a pessimistic view? Says, well, if I aid that individual, something might befall me. Again, he had a negative view of the world, or he thought evil might befall him. We're not really told, but whichever way, he did not he did not love his neighbor. And then in the next verse it says, likewise a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came, looked, and passed by the other side. So the Levite even paused for a minute and contemplated, but then also once again had that negative view, and obviously saw that it was more beneficial to him not to render aid as opposed to aid, and therefore went about his way. So in the end, we see that a Samaritan comes and renders aid to that individual. Then Christ, at the end of the parable, asked the question, who loved his neighbor? And then the Jewish man had to admit that the Samaritan was the good neighbor. So can we afford to have a pessimistic view towards our fellow man or towards our fellow neighbor? I tend to believe that we should not, and that we should always remember to be loving and to remember the principles set forth in the Scriptures. Consider Mark chapter 12, verse 33, and it says, "And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." Now you go back, if you reflect back on when Solomon dedicated the temple, the hundreds of thousands of sacrifices that just on that occasion that they offered up. Christ says that all the burnt offerings aren't counted as much as the love of the neighbor ever once. That is more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. So that should give us food for thought, or cause us to pause and to say, should I have a pessimistic view towards my neighbor that might cause me to not love my fellow neighbor? If so, we need to reflect, and I think we would come about with the mindset that we should be optimistic towards those individuals. How does our attitude affect those around us? Remember the quote that we just read about Rene Descartes, where he said, "An optimist may see a light where there is none, but why must a pessimist always run to blow it out?" Reflect upon that. If we are always negative, how can we be a shining light into others? In other words, if we always view things from a dismal aspect, how can we expect others to not view things that way? Consider Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. It says, "Let your light shine. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." If you have a pessimistic view towards the world, is your light going to be shining? I tend to believe that it's not. Again, I think you will have blown out your own light. Will we come across, I think when we take on a pessimistic worldview, I think we come across as hypocrites within the Scriptures. And if we consider 1 John chapter 3, over there in verse 18, it says, "My children, my little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and truth." In other words, we have to manifest our love. We have to show our love. It's not good enough. Again, the brother who reflected, I can love him as a fellow brother, but I don't have to like him. What is he manifesting there? Was he manifesting love in that statement? Was his ideology an ideology of love, or was it an ideology of hatred? I would argue, or I would tend to believe, that it was an ideology of hatred. So again, that pessimistic worldview brings about those thoughts, and I think if we would take an optimistic worldview and view the world, we would come out on the side of the Scriptures and how we ought to view one another. Trying to see what slide I'm on. 1 second. All right. Optimistic concerning our health. We've heard of the word hypochondriacism, or being a hypochondriac, or is an excessive preoccupation with and worry about one's health. Becoming depressed over one's health or of a loved one is I would argue, a pessimistic worldview, or a pessimistic view of that situation. Consider Romans chapter 8, verse 31, when we looked over there. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Just think of all the different aspects of life that comes our way. If we have that, if we just keep that verse in our mind, what then can we say if these things? If God is with us, is for us, who can be against us? So how can we be consumed with worldlyism and materialism and hypochondriacism? If the Lord is on our side. Consider also Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. If we flip over there. It says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things that you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, granted, this verse is talking about covetousness and that we are to be content with those possessions that we already have. But I think put it in the context of one's health. If we change covetousness with health, it says be content with your health and to be content with what you have been given. I think we come to realize that we should be content with all things, and so there is no adverse power that's greater or mightier than God. But our minds can run wild and run rampant and take away from the glory of God when we have that pessimistic worldview, or that we tend to worry, or that we're always sick and feeble and that we can't do things. I remember my father telling me about Brother Ralph Starr, and that he would always say that he was ready to go whenever the Lord would call him up, and that he never really complained about his health condition. He was ready for the Lord. He lived to be 98 and thought that the reward of heaven would be far worth more than the afflictions that he endured here on earth. And I think we should all have that optimistic view towards our health, or towards our latter years, or whatever it may be. I know when I was going through 3 or 4 years of sicknesses, pain can be a crippling effect, and it can weigh on your mind heavily. I know that I became very short, intolerant with a lot of things, and I think when we're in those situations, again, it's easy to have that pessimistic view and that woe is me. But I think if we reflect upon these scriptures that we've been quoting here, I think we would come away with that we shouldn't really be thinking that way, that we should be thankful for what we have and what we've been given, and view it from that context. And I think if we do, we will have a more optimistic view during those times of trouble. Let's consider 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, where it says, there Paul says, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And, I think Paul captures that very, very, very well. He considers it a light affliction. So whatever affliction that we suffer here on earth, in comparison to what the everlasting is going to have in store for us, is nothing but a light affliction. That's also just it's only for a moment compared to an eternity. So I think when it comes to viewing the world, I think we just have to put it in context, the bigger scheme of things, and always remember where we where we store our treasures. That's where our mind will be. If we think in heavenly terms, we will always be heavenly like creatures. But when we allow these things to consume us and take on another connotation, well, then that's when pessimism comes into our lives. What about when it comes to work and the work of the church? I came across a article by Brother Rick Liggins in the newsletter Think on These Things. Perhaps some of you are on that mail distribution list. This was quite some time ago, but he had an article called Positively Optimistic. And he pointed out in his article, he talked about pessimism as a cynic and a fatalist, or a person who is motivated in their actions by selfishness, or one who believes that all events are determined by fate and hence inevitable. And I think that's what I think he's accurate in his view of what a pessimist is there. Again, that it is one who believes that all events are determined by fate and hence inevitable. So when you have that pessimistic view, you tend to believe that no matter what you do, the outcome is going to be negative. And he pointed out, he says such a negative person not only hurts themselves but those around them. And I think again that's very true, because when you gravitate around people or when you're around somebody, your aura bleeds out on them, and it tends to be what they call infectious. So again, we need to emphasize not to be like that. He states that such negative people not only hurt themselves, but they also hurt those around them. They're especially a menace to any team effort. Their negativity tends to break the spirits of those trying to press forward and accomplish something good. The fatalist hurts the group by injecting the idea that there is no use to try. You can't change these things anyway. The pessimist hurts the group by seeing everything in the most negative way possible. Quote unquote, we've tried that before, it didn't work, or that's too hard, we'll never be able to do that. And the cynic hurts the group by questioning the motives of everybody else. You're just trying to get your own way, or you're just trying to put it in yourselves forward. Indeed, such negative people can really throw cold water on almost any project and break down team efforts to work together. And really, he's talking about the work of the church there. And how, for those men that have been in men's meetings, have you ever heard some of those lines in men's meetings? I know I've heard that before. We've tried that before. It won't work. Well, who's to say it won't? If we try again, we learn from mistakes. Why not try again? Or that one that quote, yeah, that's too hard. We'll never be able to do that. Often those pessimistic views come out in those type of meetings. We need to remember God, not fate, controls the world. So, why take on that pessimistic or world view, if you will? And so, we need to keep pessimism outside, especially when it comes to the work of the church. I think when it comes to our evangelizing the lost, I think a lot of us take on a pessimistic view that, it ain't going to do any good to go and give that person the good news, or to ask that individual to sit down and do a Bible study. They're just going to say no. And so we already, with that view, we've already defeated the purpose of going forth and spreading the good news, because we've already decided what that person is going to say. And so I don't think that's the way the Lord would have us to do things. Consider James chapter 4, verses 14 and 15, where it says, "Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live, and we will do this or that." Now, granted, James is talking about there being it eludes me. Anyways, he's talking about being presumptuous there, but I'm look at what he says there. It is even as far as our life. It says it is even a vapor that appears for a little while. He's taking that eternal view there, and that's what our life here again is on earth. It's just for a little bit of time. So why not have an optimistic view of doing the work of the church? Why not, instead of saying that individual is just going to say no, just say, well, if that individual says no, then maybe the next person may not say no. And eventually you'll come across somebody that won't say no. But it's just like sifting through a bushel basket of apples. If you sort through there long enough, you'll find a good one, the one that you really want. And so that's the same way we should be towards the work of the church. We should not take on a pessimistic view. I think we'll pause right there. I'm on slide 13, and we've been going for a little over a half hour, so we'll pause there. We'll come back tonight, and we'll finish up this lesson. But I would implore you, again, pessimism and optimism is just simply a way of viewing the world, or simply a way of thinking. And I think we just need to keep some scriptures to the forefront of our mind, and we really need to ask ourselves, should I be a pessimist towards these things, towards my fellow brother, towards the work of the church, towards life in general? Is pessimism the best way for me to be as a Christian? And we'll finish answering that question tonight. But as of right now, we want to pause, and we want to extend the invitation. The invitation is